What's up, guys? Welcome back to another video. Like I said in the previous videos, or video I should say, I'm going to be trying my hand at some MMA content since it's something I'm really passionate about and I really love. So, in this video, I'm going to basically be doing a resume ranking and going through the resume of one of the four GOATs of MMA. In this case, it's going to be Jon Jones, because a lot of people consider him the all-time great. And this is so I can create a video series on all four of the GOATs and discuss who I think is the greatest based on different criteria, that being accomplishment-wise and skill set-wise. So, based off that, I'm going to start off on Jon Jones, go through every single one of his fights chronologically, and then end the video there, and maybe see if I'd start on another video depending on how I feel while doing this, and how this video does itself. The next video, I'm not sure how I'll start on, I'll decide that then, but yeah, enjoy the video. Before we get into the actual meat of this video, talking about Jones's fights and everything, I just want to quickly discuss how I'm going to be organizing this video, and that will be broken up into three parts. One, I'm going to chronologically go through every fight in his career and give a short summary on it and my thoughts on it. That shouldn't take too long. Two, my friend and I also composed a numbered list ranking each one of his opponents from 19 to 1 based on their resumes. And three, that same friend and I, we created a scale from 1 through 5 that shows how dominant Jones was in each one of these performances, and at the end I'll simply discuss that. Now, without further ado, let's get into his resume. This is pretty good. This is a pretty good resume. Holy fuck, that's a lot of drugs. So starting this off, I'm going to be going through Jones' career chronologically. So I'm going to start with his first fight and go till his last fight recently, being that's the Ciryl Gane fight. So starting off with this, we have Andre Gusmao. It was a pretty mid performance and there was a lot of flaws, but it's very impressive for not even a year of MMA training. Jones debuted into the UFC. I think he only had 9 months of training, but it was a great display of wrestling, but really sloppy striking. It is clear that he had advantages in reach and height that will give anybody a challenge when striking. Jones also had a very prominent Greco-Roman wrestling background that he used a lot in his early career before he became much more well-rounded. So his first fight against Andre Gusmao is nothing really to take note of. It's just his basic wrestling and sloppy striking. Now his next fight is actually pretty interesting because he was given a very early test when he debuted in the UFC, or right after he debuted in the UFC, and that was against Stephan Bonner, which many of you know as one of the saviors of the UFC because of his legendary fight with Forrest Griffin. Anyways, he was an early test for an early 20s Jones, and he does pretty well. He does show slight improvements in his striking, mainly development with his elbows and the use of them. He has a very famous spinning back elbow knockdown, which is absolutely beautiful, holding Bonner's hand and then spinning around, even though it does land on the back of the head, but it's still like amazing. It was a very good performance for someone his age against a very tough and durable opponent. Moving on, we have his fight against Jake O'Brien. Jones showcases his grappling, which we haven't seen too much of so far in his last two fights, but he does go for multiple subs on top of his Greco-Roman wrestling. He even displays a north-south choke attempt, which he almost pulled off. Overall, even better progression for young Jones. At this point, we can see that he's developing more well-roundedness, seeing as now he's developing some form of tie elbows and submission. Next is the famous Matt Hamill fight, which everybody knows. Everybody is very familiar with this fight due to its ending. But just to quickly discuss the beginning of the fight, Jones does show shades of his prime. You can still tell he's a bit early, but he dominates a good step up in competition, with that being Matt Hamill. He ends up losing to a DQ because of the 12-6 elbows, which everybody is aware of, even though he should have won the fight way before because Matt Hamill was getting brutalized before that point. It should have been stopped way earlier. Next is Brandon Vera, which is even, in my opinion, a better step up in competition, but he completely dominated Brandon Vera. Just pure destruction that shows Jones is really improving as a fighter, and it is probably the greatest display up until this point of his elbows and striking. It shows that he's fully become more well-rounded. His next fight was against a man named Vladimir Matsuchenko. I believe I'm pronouncing that correct. But you can tell that this is that Jones is on an upward incline in terms of competition. There's a very clear jump every single time that he fights a new opponent in terms of how good their level of competition is. Jon made a clear domination, and we really start seeing shades of his prime with aggressive grappling, really powerful striking, which is obviously aided by his massive height and reach advantage. Next is his biggest step up yet, and that's because this fight was considered a title eliminator, and that was against Ryan Bader. Ryan Bader was a major step up who was around 14-0, I believe at the time, and was a near Jones hype level prospect. It was basically Dana throwing in two big prospects to see who would be ready for championship level, and it was Jones. For something built to be competitive, Jones absolutely dominated Bader. Pure domination that ended up in a submission via guillotine. It was in this fight where Joe Rogan told Jon Jones that Rashad Evans blew his knee in preparation for Shogun, in which Dana White wanted to give Jon an early opportunity to step in, and Jon gladly accepted it. I like to imagine this fight as one of like the clearer examples of it, or an analogy to more recent times, if you can think about it like this, on a little bit of a lower level, would be like Ilya Topuria versus Bryce Mitchell. Even though that was much lower of a skill level, seeing as they were in the lower echelons of the rankings, around like in the top 15, kind of reaching top 10 rankings, while this fight was like top 5 rankings because it was a title eliminator. Now, due to this, we can finally move on to his fight with Shogun, which begins the very famous Jones title run, which he's incredibly well known for. Now, this was an absolutely prime Jones, a nasty, devastating performance, which was unbelievable. An all-time great performance against someone who themselves, Shogun, is considered an all-time great. What's also very important to know about this is that Shogun, at this time, had a single loss in his entire MMA career, except for his 3rd fight into MMA, which was like a minor promotion against Hanato Sobrov. Besides that, Shogun was known as an absolute monster. He had torn through Pride without losing a single fight, won the Grand Prix, won the belt. He was a demon rampaging through the division, and when he came to the UFC, his only loss was a very, very large upset loss against Forrest Griffin, which nobody was expecting him to win. After that, he went on another tear, avenged his loss against Forrest Griffin, and became the champion. Except for ignoring that loss against Lyoto Machida in their first fight, because it was, in my opinion, a very clear robbery. Shogun should have won it, and he did in their rematch and completely destroyed him. Otherwise, Shogun is an absolute warrior of a resume like no other. But John made Rua look like he wasn't even meant to be in there with him. And to make it better, John was only 23 years old when he did this, making him the youngest champion in the history of the UFC. And this performance was so unbelievably dominant. And in my opinion, this is where you can see like his genetic gifts truly reach out, because Shogun, as a very large jiu-jitsu and Muay Thai fighter, liked to stay in guard dormant, as many people back and then used to. While Jones was in Shogun's guard, he could reach him with his elbows. Jones would start landing elbows from within the guard, or sitting all the way back. That was how large his reach was. Jones also completely destroyed him with kicks, nullified his submission attempts by crushing it with his wrestling and just pounding him out. And again, the very famous ending clip of Shogun almost dropping to his knees before Jones knees him in the head after landing a liver shot. This is by far, in my opinion, his most dominant performance against one of his best ranked opponents ever. While recording this, I also noticed something funny in the script. Since it was written a while ago, my friend had left at the end of the Shogun section about Jones becoming the youngest champion. The fact that it was unheard of and probably would never happen again unless someone like Raul Rosas could pull this off, which it didn't age very well, as you can tell. We went on to Jones' first title defense, Rampage Jackson. At this point, Jones was just moving in the fast lane against pure killers, back-to-back former champions. Rampage was a known beast with power that would shut your lights off with one hit. This fight was also very well marketed because Rampage is just a really funny and interesting dude. But something that really interesting I would like to mention about this is that Jones himself has said multiple times in the past that this was the only fight he was truly scared about. He said that in the lead up to this fight, he was having nightmares about Rampage just knocking him out, which I think is very interesting, especially since the fact that Jones pretty much dominated Rampage after the first round. Moving on to Jones' next title defense and one of his most famous fights yet, Lyoto Machida. Up until this point, Machida had only one loss in his career, and it was against Shogun Rua. And that was because Shogun found that if he could brawl with Machida, he could negate Machida's sniper-like reach that his karate stance gave him. Going into the fight, Jones realized that Machida was considered like a puzzle with his odd karate-like style that nobody could really figure out, and he was still giving Jones problems. Lyoto was actually the first person to take a round away from Jones in his entire pro career up until this point. But once that round was done, the adjustments that Jones' corner told him to make were beautiful. You see, the entire first round, what was allowing Machida to win was the fact that anytime Jones would try to kick him, Machida would use his very linear, sniper-like karate style to throw a cross and land it perfectly on Jones each time. And in one of my favorite adjustments ever, what Jones' corner told him to do was basically to just do a basic Superman punch. What happened was Jones threw up his leg as you're doing a Superman punch, and Machida took that obviously as the telegraph to throw the cross. Except when Machida opened himself up to throw the cross, Jones pulled his leg back, threw the Superman punch, and it landed flush on Machida's chin, dropping. A scramble ensued, and the very famous scene comes where Jones gets the guillotine, the standing guillotine under Machida's neck, holds him against the fence, and then Machida goes unconscious, and Jones drops him, and walks away from his unconscious body just laying there. By far, one of the most famous scenes, which you will see in almost every single fucking John Jones edit known to man. I promise you that. But regardless, it is by far one of his greatest performances, simply due to the fact that this was the first time anybody was able to see him actually adjusting to adversity, since he hadn't really faced any type of adversity earlier in his career. Now moving on to Rashad Evans, most probably the least entertaining of Jones' recent prime up to this point. but still a good fight. The build-up with Rashad and John beefing, seeing as they were previous training partners, and also knowing every move in each other's arsenal as they were brothers in training camp, according to themselves, was super interesting and how it would play out. In the actual fight itself, it was incredibly competitive in certain points, where neither could really get anything off until Jones started using elbows, which is another incredibly smart fight IQ move that I believe his corner told him, as they had said, training partners don't throw elbows at each other in sparring, which is very true. If you ever sparred with anybody, it's kind of taboo to throw elbows since there's no way to really protect against them. There's no way to pad them. The elbows rocked Evans badly in every exchange, especially with the step-in elbows, almost near stoppages in which leaned the fight in John's favor massively. Jones ended up taking the decision at a good 5-round fight experience. John really showed technical improvements with every kick and punch being beautifully accurate, as well as showing patience in every single combination which he was setting up with elbows. Keep in mind, John is only 25 years old at this point, and he's already defeated 4 former champions in his last 4 fights. This is the true mark of greatness, and when a lot of people started realizing that we might have something special. Now moving on to the great Chael Sonnen. And there was no real reason for this fight, and it had a really odd build-up. You see, so Chael stepped in on short notice, and John surprisingly declined the short notice fight. Now, because that happened, it should have been the end of the discussions right there, right? Bring Jones' original opponent back up for the OG matchup? Well, that's not exactly how Baldy Boy wanted it. Jones and Chael instead went on to the Ultimate Fighter for a whole season of them as coaches. And after the Jones, Sonnen Tough season, they fought in the Octagon, in which, as expected, against some middleweight like Chael Sonnen fresh off an Anderson Silva KO. Jones basically dominated Chael at Chael's own game, and with a 10.5-inch reach advantage, Jones destroyed Chael in the clinch and took him down with ease. The fight ended in a TKO for Jones, and an interesting factor is Jones actually separated his toe bone and the actual fucking toe. If Chael simply survived 30 more seconds, Chael would have actually had a win over John Jones, which I would love to live in a universe where that actually happened, where he was the champion too, and it was like over John Jones. Another factor I just quickly want to mention is that recently, Chael went on Ariel Helwani. Well, I say recently, but this was a few months ago. But he went on Ariel Helwani and he was talking about the John Jones fight, and Ariel asked him if he thought Jones was clean, because Chael admitted himself at that point that he was on roids. He was more juiced than Tropicana, as he said. And he said that Jones was definitely on roids because he was more juiced than Tropicana, but Jones was pushing him around like he was nothing. So I think that's just something kind of interesting to take into consideration. Now, finally moving on to the all too famous Alexander Gustafsson fight. And this is literally all that was written in the script for this. So yeah, pretty good. We'll watch again. 10 out of 10. Now moving on to Glover Teixeira. No, I'm joking. Alright, I'll quickly discuss the Alexander Gustafsson fight, mainly just because this is a fight that if you haven't seen it yourself, I highly recommend watching. It is one of the greatest fights of all time. It's a Hall of Fame fight, and on Tabology, it's listed as the 2nd greatest MMA fight of all time. So, I recommend pausing this video here, now with all this background knowledge, because this is one of the reasons that made the fight so great, and now going to watch the Gustafsson fight. Because right now, I'm only going to explain some of the build-up fight. So, the build-up to this fight was that Gus wasn't actually expected to do, like, literally anything against Jones. He was expected to be a huge underdog and just an easy competitor for Jones to dominate. But that's not exactly what happened, is it? Up until this point, I believe this was Jones' 5th or 6th title defense, and he had faced literally no problems at all except for the armbar attempt from Vitor Belfort and losing the round to Machida. Besides that, not a single issue in his entire career. And Gustafsson was kind of like a nobody at this point. He didn't have like too many big wins. He wasn't really that well known of a name. And pretty much the only selling point for the UFC during this entire buildup was that he was just taller than Jones, because he's 6'5". And that's not exactly the best selling point, right? But the difference was that Jones, at this point in his career, had never been taken down. He had fought great wrestlers and grapplers like Rashad Evans and Vitor Belfort, right? Ryan Bader too, and never taken down, okay? The thing is, going into this fight, this was the first time Jones actually had a massive issue against Gustafsson. Granted, he said he didn't train as much as he definitely should have because he underestimated Gustafsson, but it made for one of the greatest fights ever. In this fight, Gustafsson completely flipped the tables by surviving a lot of Jones' strikes and landing a lot more on him than people had expected. He was outboxing him in a lot of exchanges. He actually ended up being the first person to ever take Jones down, which is absolutely insane. And Jones couldn't take down Gustafsson until the 5th round at the very end, which Gustafsson crawled with one arm to the cage and got up. I remember the first time I watched this fight, I was watching it with the friend who helped me make the script, and we were just like, we were screaming. We were like, oh my God. Because we knew all the context in the background. We had hyped ourselves up, and we were like, holy shit. We were like, it was mind-blowing seeing someone doing this to Jones at this point. So, this is one of the best fights of all time, and it is made so great with the context. Without the context, it's still a great fight, but it is much better if you do watch it. I recommend watching the commentary because Joe Rogan himself does a pretty good job at explaining how incredible this is of what Gustafsson's doing. Anyways, I'll just quickly discuss the scorecards on this as well. and that being the fact that a lot of people think that Gustafsson won this fight. I don't think Gustafsson won this fight. I think it was 48-47 Jones, but a lot of people do think that Gustafsson won this fight just because it was like so unexpected, and I think it was more of an in-moment thing where we were like, holy shit. So regardless, still an amazing fight, and the first real challenge that Jones faced. And it started a trend that I noticed throughout his career, that he struggled with people who were close to him in height. Moving on to Glover Teixeira. This was just a dominant performance. He beat Glover at his own game, in the clinch, elbows, knees, and everything. Just another title defense, making it his 7th. The interesting fact about this too was that since it was right after the Gustafsson fight and Jones won it, the entire division was looking like really dry, and Strikeforce, I believe, hadn't been absorbed up until this point. So DC and other light heavyweight competitors weren't inside the UFC just yet. So it was really worrying, wondering what the hell, who the hell else was Jones supposed to fight. And in comes Glover, which he was very needed, and that's because he used to fight in the WEC and he fought pretty much everywhere else except for the UFC up until this point, and he was dominating fights. He came into the UFC as well, went on a 3-fight win streak, and was incredibly dominant, and was thought to be a massive issue for Jon Jones. Issue was that Jon Jones arm wrenched him / mirror locked him really early into the fight and pretty much disabled his arm early on. So yeah, it just made it a really dominant performance. Now reaching another incredibly famous fight in Jones' career, the first Daniel Cormier fight. With all the bad blood in this, it did feel like a super fight. It's not something like McGregor Alvarez, but probably something like Volk Islam, I would say, on that level. But as a fight, it was pretty competitive. The first 3 rounds were back and forth until Jones took away the 4th and the 5th dominantly, while taking down DC at least 3 times, for the first time in DC's career. The only round I could clearly give Daniel was round 2. Mostly had it 49-46. It was a very solid performance by Jones with a really good fight. And I also realized that this is the last fight before a silly little hit and run accident with a pregnant woman that will get Jones suspended from the UFC and stripped of his title. On top of that though, just really quickly, there's a very famous clip where Jones used a pretty dirty tactic, not gonna lie, in the 5th round, where he like raises his hands early before the bell rings, and DC does the same thing, and then Jones clips him as the bell is ringing. So just wanted to mention that real quick because I thought it was cool. Now moving on to OSP. This was the first Jon Jones performance ever since getting suspended by the UFC from a hit and run accident. So it's been a very hectic 2 years for Jones, with a hit and run including a pregnant woman, to failing a drug test for cocaine, to finally getting a fight again in the UFC, but to get 4 tickets for drag racing, which made Jon show up in court again, to DC pulling out due to a toe injury, which made OSP step in on a 3 weeks notice. For the actual fight, it was pretty bland, nothing too boring, but nothing crazy, just an okay fight. The performance is the definition of a 2, which I'll get into later describing the scale, on the dominant scale, slightly outclassing her opponent. It was interesting though, as it was the second opponent in the UFC Jon fought who was taller than him, which could explain why the performance was okay and nothing special. But there is something I would like to mention about this. While Jones was gone and being stripped, USADA was implemented into the UFC. And something that's very important about this is that this OSP performance and onwards, you can argue that there's a lot of asterisks in these Jon Jones performances, seeing as OSP was coming in on 3 weeks notice. He shouldn't have been any issue for Jones. He himself isn't an exceptional fighter at all. Should have been no issue for Jones. But you could also just chalk that up to ring rust for Jones, right? But that's not where this ends. You'll see in the later fights that I mentioned, I'll talk about in each one, but there is a little bit of like susness with how Jones performs. Anyways, let's get into the second Cormier fight, which is another example of the point I'm trying to make. I felt bad for DC though, because he put a lot of work and effort in and took the abuse of Jones testing positive during UFC 200 while the build-up was happening and DC was in the best shape of his life. I am also getting tired of how many times Jon has tested positive. This motherfucker has tested positive for coke after his hit and run, tested positive in the build-up to the DC rematch, and then after the DC rematch. I had it arguably 1-1, arguably 2-0 DC going into the 3rd. Good fight that ended up being a no contest. I also just found that they tested positive in the build-up for the Gus match. I'm not 100% sure if that's true, but I swear to fucking God if it is. Anyways, going back to that point that I made at the end of the OSP thing, DC in this fight, Jones looked dominant, but he was still losing. Like, he still arguably lost both rounds, but that head kick saved him, but then he tested positive a little bit. He did test positive a little bit. So if you can catch my drift here, I'm trying to say that before USADA, Jones was looking real good. After USADA, there's some asterisks there, if you catch my drift. But I'll move on to the Gustafsson fight, the second Gustafsson fight, because that one is actually a very dominant performance. And this one actually hurt a lot to watch as a Gus fan. Jones made minor adjustments that really shut down everything that Gustafsson had to offer. And if I'm being honest, with Jones popping every couple of fights, it's gotten me really sick of it. Watching through these interviews, I'm sick of the, after all that has happened to you, Jon, you are back, from all the media. As if he didn't cause every situation, it was his fucking fault. So overall great performance considering how close the first fight was. But what's interesting about this is that Gustafsson was coming off a 2-year layoff. He had just been knocked out, and I believe he was making a return from heavyweight, if I'm correct. If I'm not correct, I'll fix this in editing. But either way, this is not the prime Gustafsson that a lot of people are making it seem out to be. He was off a 2-year layoff, and ring rust is a real thing. So regardless, this isn't an incredibly good performance you could point to like, oh, well, this is a dominant performance he had post USADA. So there's another thing for food for thought. Moving on to Anthony Smith. It was just slow place domination. Smith had no answer really, just a slow beating by a negative 9,000 favorite. Jones also shouted at his fiance during the post-fight interview. Kind of funny, kind of silly, knowing what happens next. Anyways, the only thing of note in this fight was Jones illegally kneed Smith, but due to the Lionheart name, you know how it be, Smith didn't just take the DQ win, which I think that would have been kind of funny if Jones got a second loss, but it was because of DQ. I think that would have been fucking hilarious, but he didn't take it, sadly. But it just went on for another beating that Jones put on him for a little bit longer, so there was nothing else really of note there. Anyways, into the Santos fight. This is an odd fight, really. It was Jones' last 2 title defenses before he had that long hiatus, and it just has a very odd feeling. This fight really could have gone either way. The clear rounds I have for both, in my opinion, is 5 for Thiago, and with Jones' clearest rounds being 3. 1, 2, and 4 are honestly held to score and could go either way. The fight wasn't exactly boring, but it wasn't the most dominant John fight at all. With people saying John was washed in his last fights, especially with this upcoming one with Reyes, I think it's clear John is fighting way bigger light heavyweights than when he was in his prime. They're able to land way more and give John big problems. If you give him a layup like Anthony Smith, he does amazing. The fact Thiago Santos went to a split decision with John Jones with a torn ACL is crazy, especially since he was and like I say that they are held to score, but that's also just because how you score leg kicks, the first 2 rounds I'm referring to, because that's before Jones shredded Thiago's legs, right? He had like no tendons there, but he still went to a split decision with Jones. And this is back to the point I made way earlier with the first Gustafsson fight, was that Thiago's 6'3". This was the first time, sorry, not first time, this is the second time that someone close to Jones' height has given them real issues. And if you could imagine what a non-leg destroyed version of Thiago Santos would have done, it's pretty interesting. He probably would have won the fight with Jones if Jones didn't oblique kick him to hell. And again, another very, very iffy fight post USADA for Jones, just saying. Anyways, let's move on to the Reyes fight. Now for the Reyes fight. This is officially the last fight of John Jones' light heavyweight run, and maybe his career. I wrote this a while ago if I wrote that, Jesus. As of the actual fight, John simply just didn't win. He made it competitive by winning the last 2 rounds, but the first 3 were just clear Reyes rounds. It's a 0 on the dominance skill, but I'm happy I have actually finished the John Jones career. Didn't finish it again. Wow, I really wrote this a while ago. I have it timestamped here. Well, I didn't write it, but timestamped here. September 16th, 2022 to October 8th, 2022. Wow. Anyways, yeah, as I said, I don't think Jones won this fight at all. 1, 2, 3 Reyes clear, possibly even 4 if I'm being honest. But 5 was clear Jones, I'll admit. But it's just, I have no clue how John got the nod here. This was by far one of the worst decisions I've ever seen. So again, Reyes was 6'3", gave Jones big problems, as you could tell. And also, post-USADA performance. So, yeah, that's my agenda right there that I'm trying to push. Anyways, fuck! So I've not officially finished his record yet because he is fighting Cyril Gane March 4th at UFC 285, and there's still one more cokehead ranking. There's not much to be written about this fight. It was just a 2023 Jones heavyweight coming out, takes a nut shot, drags Gane to the ground based off Cyril overextending greatly, and pulls a guillotine in 2 minutes 6 seconds of the first round. I mean, this is his most dominant title win ever, besides maybe the Shogun win. And John just calls out Stipe at the end, which is smart. I watched Stipe would be a massive advantage in name value on John's record, especially since Stipe is 41 now, so there's not much risk there either. Anyways, that's finishing with his record and the chronological order of all his fights. So I'm going to move on to the next part, which is ranking his resume wins.
I should also mention there's a 100% money back guarantee on this.
Yeah. Who got that good D? I got that good D. Yeah.
No, it's too hard.
So I already discussed what this was going to be earlier in the video, but basically we have a list that is just ranking how impressive it was that Jones beat a certain opponent with a number next to the opponent's name. That number is the rating of how dominant Jones was in the fight. This is based off a dominance scale that we created, which is 1 through 5. 1 signifies super competitive, the fight could go either way. 2 signifies slightly outclassing your opponent. 3 signifies dominant but opponent is still in the fight. 4, all that's written for 4 is just destruction in bold. Now 5 is impressive destruction for impressive opposition. So it would have to be a 4, but for a person who you would not imagine would get a 4. What this means is that that person has to have a pretty good resume, or they have to be high ranking for it to be a 5. An example of this would be GSP versus John Fitch. So with that, here are the rankings. Alright, so that's the end of the video, and those are my rankings. If you have any complaints about it, comment them down below. I don't really give a shit though, so I'm not going to respond. Fuck you, bite me. Anyways, because this is the end of the video, you know how I always like to end off with some sort of epilogue. And that's just going to be the fact this time that I did not have nearly as much fun as I thought I would making this. And I think that's mainly just the fact because I was so inexperienced, I didn't really know how I wanted to go about this, that I just I did all of the recording in one day in like 3 or 4 hours, and I was waffling so fucking much about the different fights. Like in the actual script, it was like really short sections. I was like, oh, maybe that's not that much. Maybe I should give more information. I definitely shouldn't have, because I give myself so much more work when it came to editing this, and I really regret that. And it was literally just a trudge to get through this. So I don't know if I'm going to be doing any more of these videos in the future because of that. Maybe I'll do one more where I try to do it where I'm not waffling and try to compress it a little bit more. Because I didn't want this video to be more than like 20 minutes max. I thought it was going to be 15, hell, maybe even 10. This video is almost 25 fucking minutes. I did not want it to be like this at all. And you can tell that there's very minimal editing in this. There's like nowhere near like my level of creativity in the last 2 videos. So I'm not happy with the outcome of this video like at all. So I'm not sure if I'm going to be doing this in the future because of that. But I also feel like shit right now because I just ate like a shit ton of greasy ass wings. So I don't know how much more effort I really want to put into this. And I also kind of rushed myself. I wanted to get it done in a day, which was an unrealistic expectation, especially with the amount of work I gave myself by waffling. Secondly, I wanted to get it done in 2 days, which was even less realistic because I realized that. And I have a trip tomorrow because I'm hoping this gets uploaded by Friday night. I have a trip Saturday morning, so I was trying to cram all this in so I could get it done before I went on that trip. And I think I did, hopefully. But regardless of that, you can tell that this video just isn't up to the standard I would have liked it to be. So I might try my hand at this one more time with another resume ranking and see how that does and if I can do it better. And if I can't, then that's the last of that. Hell, I might even trash that video. But this is like the beta experiment of this. So yeah, see you guys later.